I'm sure I speak for everybody here when I say that the HA is very happy to welcome Trevor Jones, our very first guest speaker at McMaster Innovation Park. Trevor is the creator of Astro Backyard, a popular astrophotography website and YouTube channel. I lifted that directly from what he sent me, info he sent me. He said it was popular. Take that as well. No, it's fantastic. It's fantastic. So from his light-polluted backyard in St. Catharines, captures deep sky objects using a variety of camera and telescope equipment. His mix of passion for his craft, willingness to share realistic ups and downs of being an everyday amateur astronomer is what has made Astro Backyard such a great success. Trevor brings his YouTube audience along for the ride, through every mistake, every triumph, and every run-in with his dog. How's Rudy?
He's great.
Excellent, that's good. Speaking of Trevor's family, talking of Rudy, speaking of his family, those of you that do follow him online may also know that he and his wife Ashley, there's Ashley right there, also are the bird nerds. And if that is also well worth checking out, it's fantastic. I have had the opportunity to hear Trevor speak before at other venues. For the past 2 months, I have been encouraging you to check out his website and his YouTube channel. If you have, then you know why I am so excited to have Trevor here tonight. Please give a warm welcome to Trevor Jones.
Thanks for that introduction, John. So again, my name is Trevor Jones, and I'm very excited to speak here at the HAA members meeting in your new venue. My parents grew up in Hamilton, and I've got lots of family here, so I even lived here for a few years as I attended Mohawk College for graphic design. That was going back quite a while now, though. So I now live in St. Catharines, and I've been photographing the night sky from my backyard in the city since about 2010. I'm truly addicted to the hobby of astrophotography, and I'm not afraid to say it. After living with my parents for far too long, there we go. My wife Ashley and I bought our first house in 2015. We're right in the heart of town, a class 8 on the Bortle scale, if you're familiar with that. But that's what light pollution filters are for. It was the first time in my life that I had a backyard to call my own, and I treated it like my personal observation window to the night sky. In this picture you can see kind of how cramped it was back there, a lot of porch lights, confused neighbors, street noise, like we were pretty much right downtown. So I think a lot of people appreciated the fact that I was doing this hobby in a situation like this. It kind of opened the eyes to a lot of people that thought maybe it wasn't for them to do deep sky astrophotography in the city. Is there anyone else that knows the Bortle scale class that they are in their backyard? And that's like a class 8, or what class are you? 7? Okay, so very similar. A lot of light pollution. Luckily we have light pollution filters that can actually do astonishing things. So it's really accessible to everybody no matter where you live. So with my 4-legged companion at my side, invisible at night except for his white nose, I spent every clear night under the stars with my camera and telescope firing away in this house that was new at the time. So I began documenting my astronomy experiences in the backyard, and I called it Astro Backyard. I would spend all night editing my videos after a night of imaging, and then get 2 hours of sleep and go into work the next day. I'm happy to report that over 100 videos and nearly 80,000 YouTube subscribers later, Astro Backyard is now my full-time job. So when I meet new people and they ask me what I do for a living, I get to say I take pictures of space. So they usually have a few follow-up questions after that. But seriously, having the opportunity to share my passion with groups like you is extremely rewarding and an honor. So we've since moved to a slightly less polluted sky in St. Catharines. It's a class 6 now, but it's the same sort of deal. The window of sky available in the backyard was a huge deciding factor on the house that we chose. And luckily, Ashley was okay with that. The backyard had to be right. So this presentation is called 7 Ways to Improve Your Astrophotography. And I'm not going to break each of the ways out specifically by number, so you have to trust me that there's at least 7 tips here how to improve your astrophotography. I know that some of you are already taking impressive images of the night sky. Your calendar is proof of that. So, and others are just getting started in the hobby. So how many of you are currently doing astrophotography and have tried it in this crowd? It looks like about half of you, which is not surprising. So astrophotography is a really broad term for a lot of styles and techniques. Some of the most common ways to partake in the hobby are wide-angle nightscape style shots like this, or you could be photographing the moon and the planets through a telescope eyepiece or the sun, and then deep sky imaging through a telescope and a tracking mount, and that's what I love most. There's also star trails, meteor showers, aurora, solar and lunar eclipses, and the list goes on. So astrophotography covers a lot, but I'm mostly into this long exposure, deep sky astrophotography. That's my specialty. So you can really get started in astrophotography using any camera. Even phone cameras are capable of taking even a 10-second exposure now. But my favorite weapon of choice for astrophotography is an entry-level DSLR camera. It's affordable, it's versatile, and they're capable of amazing things, and that's what gets a lot of people in the door. So, somebody's having a good time with me. There's so many areas of this hobby to explore, and that's one of my favorite things about it. So high magnification planetary photography is the one that's kind of different than everything that I do. It requires kind of a different set of equipment and a different processing style as well. So people that find a niche in this hobby and they tend to stick with it. So people that are really like to monitor Jupiter and its moons and get high resolution photos will kind of go down a path in the equipment needed for that style of astrophotography and stick with it. And there's some amazing imagers in that line. I'm more, as I said, in the deep sky astrophotography world, which is photos like this. These are some recent deep sky images using really not very sophisticated gear. It's actually this little mount right here, which is it's classified as a camera tracking mount, not even for a telescope. It did use a small telescope on it, but it was very similar to a telephoto lens the telescope used here. So the one thing that all of these methods of astrophotography have in common is that there's 2 sides of the story, and that's the image acquisition stage and the processing stage. So most people tend to enjoy one aspect more than the other, but I can honestly say that I love the entire experience from start to finish. The image processing stages have a particularly steep learning curve, and especially if you're new to image editing software and just using a computer that way. So the journey to an incredible astrophoto involves a lot more work than most people realize. But as complicated as astrophotography may seem to others, the process is actually not that hard. We're just taking ultra long exposures in the dark and pulling out light in post-processing to sum everything up. Now, some objects are very bright and not much pulling is needed. So stunning objects like the Andromeda Galaxy shown here actually need to be toned down in certain areas to balance things out. And it's this balancing act of light that makes processing images of space so challenging and rewarding. I feel like it's important to get this out there too, because this is something that I kind of realized after doing astrophotography for 5-6 years. I realized this, that the collection of light and the building of images makes astrophotography very creative. So you decide the direction your image should take, because what we actually see visually and what our cameras collect are worlds apart. So keep that in mind when getting constructive criticism from others because chances are that their perfect image is different from yours. So I really love the idea of capturing a feeling or the mood of our incredible existence here on Earth. Pictures that can almost make you feel the air and hear the sounds of where the picture was taken. These images are often simple photos using a camera and stationary tripod. So these are the kind of images that beginners get that really inspire them to keep moving forward, and I still love this style today. And so I checked out your club's website, and there's an impressive and diverse photo gallery on there. And I pulled out these two images in particular because they illustrate the point. So is Janice here as well?
Yep. Yes.
Well done, yes. So, and John, I literally just pulled these ones out. I was like, oh wow, there's John's one over there too. So they create a feeling that reminds us of our place in the solar system and how small we really are. So it's my absolute favorite feeling, and I try to reflect on this as much as possible. And a hobby like astrophotography is probably the best way to keep reminding yourself of that. So like specifically what I love about these is that when you can see the planetary pairings and the moon at that time of day, first of all, it's just a magical hour of the day, the feeling, and that you can feel how cold it is in this picture, the cool blues. But when you get the landscape details in those trees, you can feel how we're on our planet, but we're looking out into our solar system. Just an amazing feeling. And I thought those photos were really special because they captured that. So the deeper and deeper you get into astrophotography, the less it feels like regular, traditional daytime photography. If you have a solid understanding of how your daytime camera works, you'll have a much easier time getting astrophotography results early on. So here's an overview of the typical camera settings for astrophotography because they're much different than what you would use in the daytime. So that's using manual or bulb mode, fast aperture on your lens, the white balance setting to daylight or auto, although that doesn't really matter. Your exposure length is going to be longer, 15, 30 seconds. Those are settings you would never use in the daytime. You want to always shoot in raw image format because you have more control of your data after you've taken it. An ISO of 400 to 1600 or much more. Again, very aggressive, low light camera settings that don't make sense in the day but make total sense for astrophotography. And then the 10-second delay drive mode. So even just pressing the shutter button on your camera is enough to shake a long exposure image. So you'll want to step away from the camera and use those delay timers. But obviously to generalize these tips leaves out the variations and nuances that occur when putting these steps into practice. For example, I said that use a low fast aperture of f2.8. Well, sometimes lenses perform better when you stop them down and step them back a bit because these stars are a pretty challenging subject for any lens. So sometimes you'll get chromatic aberration, or stars generally look better as you stop your lens down. So that's something to think about. The 500 rule is something, it's really old, and many of you might have heard it before. It's back from the film days. And the 500 rule is for people that are shooting the night sky with a stationary tripod that's not moving along with the motion of the sky. And it's just a rule of thumb, not to be taken too literal, for the exposure time you can expect to shoot before the stars will trail. So the 500 rule on a full frame camera would be divide the focal length by 500. And that's the amount of time you could shoot an exposure for before the stars will begin to trail. So with a 50mm lens and a full frame camera, that'd be 10 seconds. But it's give or take. It's not a set in stone rule, but it's a good reference point. Basically, you could really just shoot for as long as you can until you notice that stars begin trailing, and just go by that. Focusing the camera is, believe it or not, I think out of all the questions I get from beginners, focusing the camera, it seems so simple. But it's actually very challenging. And the biggest thing is using a different set of camera settings when you're focusing than when you're actually shooting your actual target. So of course you want to use manual focus mode on your camera lens, and take the time to really get it nailed down, because noise and even slight star trailing, they can be corrected or hidden in post-processing. Whereas an out of focus shot can't be fixed, it's just gone forever. So Even if it eats into your night and you get less done, you want to take the time to make sure that focus is as good as possible. So to focus your camera lens, it really helps to use a really bright star, a planet, or if you don't have something like that, because there are times of the year where you don't have that available to focus on, you can use a man-made source of light, a street lamp in the distance to focus on. So with the right camera settings, you should see at least one bright star in the display screen of your DSLR camera, and that's all you really need to find focus. And there's some back and forth and trial and error, but eventually, if you go in and out long enough, you'll find a point where you can actually get the star as small as possible, and then it's a matter of leaving it in focus like that and moving to your actual subject. So here's the aggressive camera settings for focusing, which is again manual mode, manual focus. For focusing, you want to use your fastest f ratio as possible to let in as much light, and then leave it wide open and a really aggressive ISO setting to hopefully pull in a star that you can use for focusing. So some of the brightest stars in the northern hemisphere to help you focus are Sirius, Vega, Deneb, Altair, Arcturus. These are all bright enough to see. Even some of the older DSLRs that aren't as great in low light photography will see these ones. So if you're trying to focus your camera, and I remember being there, and you don't see anything, the lens cap could be on. You're not using the exaggerated camera settings for maximum light, your ISO, your exposure, your f-stop, or the lens is so out of focus that you just don't see anything at all. And eventually you'll see that giant star come into focus. So you could have every setting right, but you have accidentally stopped your lens down to f22, and that's enough to absolutely see nothing. And you'll just be scratching your head as to why you can't focus. So once you've got that precious focus in place, the trick is to not knock it out of alignment when you do move to your target, because camera lenses have these helical focusers, which is not very hard. If you grab the lens to move it around like this on a ball head, you could easily knock it out of focus just by moving the camera, just in that adjustment. Luckily, most times, it's not enough to completely be out, and it's just some test shots on your subject after that. So you want to use that live view magnification mode, that 2 times or 10 times live view when you're focusing that star. So sometimes you might get lucky and choose a subject. This is at a recent star party, actually. Just wanted to explain this one. This is that mount, the mount you see right here, a Skywatcher Star Adventurer, and they used to take those images I showed earlier of the Pleiades and the Andromeda Galaxy. And this is under Bortle Class 2 skies. I believe it's a 2 or 3 at Cherry Springs State Park. Yep. So, just unbelievable skies. And look how many stars you can see. At home, of course, you would just see Cassiopeia and Pleiades and a few more. But yeah, so beautiful location. I highly recommend you go to the Cherry Springs State Park when you can. So choosing and finding your subject, that's another difficult part early on, because some of the subjects you want to shoot, like the California Nebula here, they're difficult to see in a short test exposure, 10, 30 seconds. You might see a hint of something. So the question is, how do you find these objects and frame them up and actually know what you're shooting? And the answer is use a planetarium app. Like I use Stellarium. If there's a free, it's either free or $1.99, but I regularly pull up my phone and check Stellarium for the location of objects and kind of triangulate the position based on the stars. And sometimes you get lucky where there's a really bright star in the frame, so you can actually focus on that star with your deep sky object in the frame and start firing away. Constellations, the Milky Way, meteor showers, other wide-angle subjects are practical choices for beginners because they don't require a lot of focal length, and they're most forgiving in terms of tracking. And so most of the shots you've seen this far, especially the deep sky ones, were on a tracking equatorial mount that compensates for the apparent rotation of the night sky. How many of you are using tracking mounts for astrophotography? So most of the astrophotographers, which is it's a game changer, because then you can shoot 2-3 minute exposures without star trailing. You can forget all about that 500 rule and just never think about it again, because now you're moving with the apparent rotation of the night sky. So wide angle nightscapes at dusk, again, is all the different disciplines in this hobby. I just love these ones and capturing these moments. So this is the magical 20 minutes where the stars are out, but there's still color in the sky from the setting sun. That's a truly gorgeous moment. I believe John's photo showed that well. I'm a sucker for the belt of Venus, and I point it out every time I see it to my wife. And when I ask her what it's called, she always says the belt of Jupiter, just to get me going. So that's the belt of Venus there, that pink, beautiful pink glow, and that was actually a super moon coming up, rising there. I took this one clearly in the winter, and I believe I just wanted to take a shot of this moment to share it on the Weather Network or something. But there's always these great astronomical, celestial events that are great to document in astrophotography. So again, there's just so many sides to it. But the deeper you go in terms of subjects, and the more demanding the equipment gets. So this is a recent shot from the backyard at home, and even with a small camera tracker, locating and framing your target can be challenging, as I said before. So the image shown on the screen here is the Heart and Soul Nebulae. They were shot using pretty beginner-friendly gear. This was shot exactly with the rig you're seeing here. So this little tracking mount, this is a Rokinon 135mm f2 lens. I highly recommend that lens. And then the camera is a Canon 60DA. So who's heard the term a camera that's been modified for astrophotography before? Again, it's the same crowd, so you guys are well versed already. So basically, all that means is that the certain wavelength emitted by emission nebulae like these two, those red colors, you're going to pick those up in a modified camera or one that was made for astrophotography by Canon, the Canon 60DA. Whereas a regular camera has the internal stock IR cut filter is actually blocking those reds out because it's not useful for daytime photography, and it would create weird skin tones. So yeah, like a modified DSLR is going to get a lot more detail on targets like this, on emission nebula, full of hydrogen, and there's a lot of great nebulae that are just like this kind of composition. So the difficult thing about this subject is that these nebulae are very faint. I know they're kind of popping out of the screen here, but even in a 30-second text exposure with aggressive settings, only the very brightest areas of the Heart Nebula were, where's the pointer? Is it the little red?
Yep.
Yeah. So the only areas that were actual visible on the test exposure were these two areas. It was mostly the Fishhead Nebula here, which is a subset of the Heart Nebula. Yeah. That was the only thing I had to go by to frame it up. So again, kind of checking my planetarium app to see the orientation of where these objects need to be. And you know, setting that, making sure that portion of the Heart Nebula is right there, so I know it's going to have enough room to actually frame these up too, because a lot of these objects, you're pulling them out in the processing, whereas the single exposures that you're actually taking on the camera at the time, you don't see any of this. You really have to pull that out of there. So it's kind of interesting, and that's a hurdle early on for people, is finding objects and framing them up. And ones like this are quite difficult. If you're using a go-to telescope that allows you to punch in a target and will slew to it for you, if it has accurate pointing accuracy, it will just slew to it for you. You can be confident that it's centered in the frame and not have to worry about it. But the manual mounts like this, you have to find it yourself. But it's a great way to learn the night sky. It's one of the reasons why I started as a visual observer with a Dobsonian telescope, and I kind of learned the sky, the most impressive deep sky objects before I got into astrophotography. Being that this is an astronomy club, I know that a lot of you started visually as well, as opposed to just jumping straight into astrophotography. So, as I said, some objects don't really come out until you've taken a 3-minute exposure. Anyone that's ever photographed a bubble nebula before can attest to that. So you can almost see something going on right here, and you're like, I know there's a bubble in there somewhere. But it's these long exposure images that you stack before you can finally reveal these beautiful structures. And a lot of it is the filters that we use too, and I'll get into that soon. So shooting in RAW mode, you heard me talk about that earlier, and signal to noise ratio. This image, actually, look at it here, it does look quite noisy too, but I think I pushed the saturation a little too much. I just got a little excited with the beautiful nebulae in there. So when you shoot in RAW mode, basically you have all these options that you can control the data that you shot after the fact. So things like white balance and noise reduction, sharpening, saturation, all those things you can control after you've taken the shot. So you don't want to be shooting in JPEG really ever for astrophotography. Always shoot in RAW because it gives you more options afterwards. So if you open up a RAW image and you use Adobe Photoshop for editing your photos, do we have a lot of Adobe Photoshop users here? Yeah, again, quite a few. And who's using something else? Anyone using GIMP? Okay, yeah, which is very close to Photoshop, right? Which one?
Capture One.
Capture One? Haven't even heard of that one. Yeah. Star Tools, okay, yep. And there's Pix and Sight again, which is a lot more advanced. Photoshop's the one a lot of people start with, especially if you have a little bit of a photography background. So when you open up a RAW image in Photoshop, my favorite tool ever comes up, and it's called Adobe Camera Raw. And that's where you just use these very intuitive sliders to adjust the image and make really powerful changes, like reduce the noise and boost saturation. So some of the things you would do to an image at that stage, a single image frame, like I did on this one, was, although this is a stack, white balance, noise reduction, sharpening, saturation, a lot more. So the main thing to consider when adjusting individual exposure is that it's actually better to stack a series of images together rather than to try and do too much to your single shot. There's situations like that one of the moon and the belt of Venus earlier, and those looks like those landscape shots that you guys, John and Janice took. Those were probably single shots, and it's a good example because there's enough light. You can get a great shot without using aggressive ISO settings to get a single shot. But this, anything where you're shooting into the darkness and pulling out faint details, you're always going to benefit from taking several shots and stacking them and combining them together. Some of you, I'm sure you know all about this, but it might be an eye-opener for some. So who here has heard of the signal-to-noise ratio? The same group of people just knows everything. Okay, we're all on the same page there. But for anyone that doesn't know, so the signal-to-noise ratio is everything in deep sky astrophotography. That's a bold statement. It's everything, but it's the difference between. So that's a single exposure on the top there, not white balanced or anything, and that's a stacked set of rather limited stack. I believe there's only 16 or 18 shots of the Orion Nebula in there. So stacked and processed. And it just shows you the difference between what you see on your camera screen when you take the photo and what the image you end up with after processing. So it's just not possible to get to the bottom photo from the single image on top. You need to stack your exposures because signal is the light and the detail and the color of the nebula, the stars. Everything that we care about is signal, whereas the noise is just the artifacts and the things, the ugliness that comes along with a hot camera sensor and just the way a DSLR camera works, because it really wasn't meant for taking these type of images. But you're going to deal with noise in your image, and stacking is one of the best ways to reduce that. So overcoming noise can happen with integration. So we'll get a stronger signal and less noise. And so you can stack these images. There's ways to do it manually. You can do it yourself in programs like Adobe Photoshop, or there's specialized software that's stacked for you. And in most situations, that's what you want. I use a free software called Deep Sky Stacker to handle stacking. I've been using that for a long time. And basically, you just load in all of your images, your individual images, and some calibration frames, which I won't get into. And it's going to create an image with a better signal-to-noise ratio, which is really helpful when processing. So I just threw this in here because it's a great. It just shows you the image scale. So that little inset picture there on the left, that's the area up close. This is the Satyr region. Is it Satyr or Saturn? That's star in Cygnus. Who knows how to pronounce it? No one's willing to come up. Is it Saturn? Solder. Oh, wow. I've been calling it Satyr. Okay, so that's the Solder region there. That's the Butterfly Nebula here. And so this is that's basically Cygnus right there, the constellation Cygnus. You can see a lot of interesting objects over here. That is, we're in the Cepheus, and there's the Elephant's Trunk Nebula. But it's just pretty cool to when you shoot with different focal lengths of lenses and telescopes, you'll never get tired of shooting the same objects because they become completely different things as you shoot using different optical equipment. It makes a lot of sense to stack your exposures and that signal to noise ratio when doing deep sky astrophotography. It's pretty well a must. But in certain situations, you might not think that, you know what, I'm not going to stack this shot because the ground isn't moving, but the sky is. So sometimes you have to get creative, and this is in Photoshop, just showing an example of masking where so the sky was moving, but obviously the ground wasn't, and that creates a mismatch, right? You're going to have these blurry trees in your night sky image, and in your landscape, if you're exposing for the landscape to get the green trees, you're going to have a blown out sky, and that's trailing. So combining the two together using a mask like this and blending the area between it, that's what makes landscape style astrophotography with these long exposures so difficult, but you can create these amazing images. And I believe that photo on the back of the Observer's Handbook not this one, by Carrie Ann was done that way. She does a lot of landscape astrophotography, and I really admire her work because to combine the two, it's challenging, but it creates amazing images. So even if it's just a landscape photo, like the ones we shot earlier, you will benefit from taking 2 or 3 shots and stacking them together. So we talked about, I already asked you about Photoshop. So it has this amazing feature in it called Select and Mask. So earlier we talked about some more basic beginner stuff, focusing and everything. Whereas now we're going to get into more of the, hopefully this is useful to even some of the more advanced imagers. It's my favorite feature of Adobe Photoshop, Select and Mask. And it wasn't necessarily designed for astrophotography, but I found it to be incredibly useful when processing deep sky images. This is the Orion Nebula. It's a combination of data shot. The one I shared earlier and some previous images of Orion scaled and combined together. And that's another great thing about astrophotography. These long-term projects you can work on for years and years, and they just keep getting better as you pile on the exposure time. So creating masks in Photoshop is basically separating parts of your image from others. So it allows you to carefully edit one area of the image without disturbing the other. And believe it or not, that's something you want to do a lot when processing astrophotos. We're often in situations where we want to brighten or sharpen or increase the saturation of one area of the image but not the others. If you do these global universal changes and you're just paying attention to one thing, like say I brought out the dim areas here, but I brought it up globally, this would get very blown out. It's already starting to get blown out, but you don't want to bring all the light forward at once. You just want to select certain areas. So with this tool, the Select and Mask, and I've just kind of indicated where the mask is, and it looks kind of funny, it looks soft, but it's supposed to be like that. I start with a simple tool called Select Color Range. So I selected, you can see the areas that it's kind of grabbing, it's kind of ignored the bright areas of the nebula. I've just grabbed the outer areas of the nebula, and specifically the more blue areas. So there's a tool called Select Color Range in Photoshop where you can actually use the eyedropper sampler and select the blue areas of the image. Then you can use this Select and Mask tool to really refine that mask and control exactly the areas of the image that it's grabbing, and that's where the power is, because never has there been a way in Photoshop before this tool to get as accurate in your selections. And by giving you this overlay, it actually shows you exactly where you're playing with this image, what's going to be adjusted. So these masks are so powerful when processing, because you can really process certain areas of the image in a very intentional way. So the soft edges that you see here, it's not a very defined mask. That's very important because that's the transition between the areas that you've selected and the ones that you're not touching. If there was a hard edge on that mask there and you had pulled any of the details forward, it would just look very unnatural. It would look awful actually, because there would be a hard, strange line between that. But with that soft mask, you're gently pulling the dimmer details forward in a very more natural looking way. And that's why I said earlier that astrophotography is rather creative, right? I'm sure there are some people that would say like, well, now you're changing the brightness of this object, and that's not how it really looks, right? But none of this is how it really looks visually through your telescope anyway. So you get a lot of creative freedom that way. But there's a responsibility there to be scientifically accurate where you can, and there's a lot that goes into that too. So you can kind of see it here. I use that mask to brighten up those dimmer areas that the mask was selecting from the original, and that was just for demonstration purposes, but you get the idea, I hope. So whether you brighten up the areas or you sharpen certain areas, maybe you want kind of the tendrils in here sharper, but you don't want to sharpen up the brown dust in here or get those stars too crunchy. So it just allows you to control your image and steer it in the direction that you want in a very intentional way, as opposed to, let's apply this to the whole photo and see if it made it better. And again, this is getting a little more advanced too now, is narrowband filters. I talked earlier about light pollution filters from the city and their power and how it's it really makes this hobby accessible to all of us. This is a hydrogen alpha filter, and this is just in use with a DSLR camera. This one was actually a Canon Rebel T3i, so a very affordable aging camera that has been modified for astrophotography, but this is the Rosette Nebula. And as you can see, the contrast, it just jumps off the screen. Without using this filter, you would see it there, but you would pick up all the light pollution as well, whereas this is just isolating that hydrogen in the Rosette Nebula, and it's really, really dramatic. If you like black and white images, you'll have a heyday just with an H-alpha filter. But what I like to do is combine narrowband images into my color images to give them a pop. So there's something called a luminance layer, which is essentially just adding the signal or light in this channel and pasting that on top of your color image just to pull out those bright areas. It's a very powerful technique, and narrowband astrophotography is really exciting. There's a lot of challenges that come with it, and it gets expensive because the filters themselves are expensive. But if I could recommend to you, if you're shooting color astrophotography with a DSLR, get yourself a clip-in DSLR filter, H-alpha specifically, because it fits inside of the camera body, underneath the camera lens, whether you're using it with a telescope, a lens, anything. You can dip into the power of narrowband imaging. The reason they call it narrowband is because if you can picture the visual spectrum, and the broad spectrum is across the full wavelength. This is a great description, I know. But the narrowband is just isolating in this case, the 656 nanometer wavelength, which is where these H2 regions reside. So isolating that light, blocking out street lamps, all the light that you don't want. So if you're not interested in building images the way I talked about, shooting it in color and then H-alpha and getting it together, there's these things called multi-band pass filters now, and they're still relatively new. They definitely weren't around when I started this hobby, but they're kind of amazing for city astrophotographers because they create these images that are rather true looking in terms of color, not just black and white, in a single shot with a color camera. So this is the Cave Nebula shot with, this one was the Optolong L Enhance, and it's a dual bandpass filter. So when they build these filters, they can actually selectively choose which wavelengths of light they want to isolate, which ones they don't. Instead of just a single line on the wavelength, they can actually get, okay, let's get a little bit of the O3, the oxygen, and let's get a little bit of the hydrogen as well. And that's exactly what this one, and even a little bit of the H beta. So that as these filters advance, color astrophotography from the city is getting a lot more obtainable, and it's actually not even fair for the people that have been in this hobby for a long time, shooting through separate filters with a monochrome camera, and the amount of time that they had to take and time investment and effort to create these color images, whereas now these multi-band pass filters create these pretty impressive images in one shot. So yeah, this is pretty proud of that one because that's from the city. So to wrap things up here, the best thing about astrophotography is the thrill of the ongoing progress that you make. So once you're able to collect great data, no matter what that means to you, whether that's wide-angle nightscapes or deep sky, data that was captured in focus and that signal-to-noise ratio and the stacking, you can go back and reprocess it later. This is a great example. This is from 2011. And the first time I processed this photo, it looked nothing like this. I made all sorts of mistakes. But I processed it again this year. And now, because the data was so great, there was actually an amazing image hidden in there. And I'm sure in 2 years from now, I'll try it again, and it will look even better as you progress your processing skills. So I would suggest get good at acquiring good data early on, and then as your image processing skills advance, you can revisit those projects and even continue adding to them. So it's really unique that way. It's a really unique form of photography. The progress that you make might be slow and extremely frustrating at times. I mean, the weather's involved, right? We're limited to clear skies, which can be extremely rare here in Southern Ontario, especially around this time of the year. But it's these small victories along the way, in an in-focus shot, seeing color in your nebula, creating your first final image, showing someone the picture you took, and then just being like, the best one is they say, "You took that?" Like, that's not real. Like, that's a huge compliment for people to say that, because it really is unbelievable what we can do. So by paying attention to those small victories along the way, you can remind yourself of why this hobby got you excited in the first place. And that's what you need to keep moving forward, that progress. So I'll open it up now to any questions. We can go back to any of the slides that I showed previously. I know I kind of dipped into a lot of areas, but I was really unsure of the progress level here, the beginners versus the advanced. Yes, sir?
This photograph that you have on the screen right now,
Yep.
how deep could you go in detail? Could you go right into the central core of that and magnify that out?
So with this shot, so if I have this open in Photoshop, so it's about 4,000 pixels wide. This one would look pretty good. It was shot with an 80mm refractor, so pretty wide field. And yeah, the resolution is good, but with a wide field instrument like this, it's kind of one or the other. So shooting, if I isolated just the lagoon with a higher magnification, a lot more detail, of course. There's a limitation to the amount of resolution you can get when shooting wide like that, but yeah, this one looked pretty good up close. And that's a real testament to the quality of the data as well. But yeah, it's usually one or the other.
Thank you.
No problem. Yes, sir.
Does that L-enhanced filter mess with your color balance too?
It does, yes.
There, yeah.
So the image I shot, the Cave Nebula, speaking of color balance, this was shot not with a DSLR, but a cooled one-shot color camera with an APS-C size, basically a DSLR sensor, but that was cooled and modified. So the images out of the camera here were very green, extremely green, because it's called the Bayer filter has an RGGB pattern on it, so more green than anything else. And yeah, you have to play with it a lot to get the balance right. And it's more than just neutralizing the blacks in it, which you can tend to do in a color picture to get things right. This one, you really have to play with the image on a per channel basis. Those reds had to come right up, blues up, green way down. Yeah, there's a lot of color manipulation with those images. Oh, sorry, with those filters.
Okay.
Yes.
This is sort of related to what you just answered. What color space are you working in when you're doing your post-process?
So it's the default Photoshop, which is, I believe, it's either Adobe RGB or sRGB.
Okay, so you don't use lab, you mentioned
I
somewhere?
do not use lab, no. But going back to the channels, that's probably, if anyone saw, a video I shared quite recently about processing, it was dealing with these images on a per channel basis and adjusting them independently. Like that is a really powerful way to control your image, so that each channel RGB, that's what makes a color image, you can manipulate that data on its own and combine them together. So stuff like if the stars had a red glow in this picture, which isn't natural, not true, you could go and look in that red channel, and sure enough, those stars in that red channel would be bigger than they were in the blue and green channels. So to correct that issue, you could minimize the stars in only the red channel. And when you're able to manipulate the images on a per channel basis, you have complete control. That's kind of stepping into the world that these monochrome imagers that shoot with a monochrome camera and build their images through filters.
How much of the various filters that you mentioned in the tracking notes, what do these cost?
So this one here, I believe, is around, I always see the American prices, about
American
500.
prices are good.
Oh, yeah. So around $500 for this one, give or take. And this one has kind of a bit of a kit to it. There's attachments, a counterweight kit to it. So for anyone that's looked around at these equatorial mounts and telescopes, $500 in astrophotography is really affordable. So that's for the mount. And then the filters, they can get so pricey. The most ridiculous one is the OPT Triad filter. And I just realized I probably won't want to share this video because I'm good friends with OPT. It's so overpriced. It's over $1,000 for this little piece of glass, and it's a tri-band filter. So it's trying to do everything. And there's a lot of advanced optics in creating filters like that. But the Allen Hans here is about $200, $250. That's only so much to talk about. But yeah, calibration frames are essentially just ways to tell the stacking software to calibrate the image, get rid of things like dust and noise and some other things, gradients.
Okay, for me.
Good questions. Yes, John.
You talk about coming back and revisiting an object, not in terms of processing, but in terms of data collection, and being able to add more data, season after season, right? Year after year as it comes around again. How do you make sure that your orientation in the camera and aim is close enough so that you don't end up losing large margins around the edge of the frame?
So, like everything else, the deeper you go, the more magnification, the longer focal lengths, the harder that gets, along with tracking and everything else. For these wide field projects, like let's say Orion here, say I was shooting it through the same telescope, so I know that's the same image scale and everything years later. That part's easy. As for framing it up, reference image, line it up. You could take a test shot and overlay an image on top of it, kind of at a low transparency to try and line it up. But of course, these image acquisition software that are available have tools, plate solving, where it can actually match it up exactly. It does a readout of the position of the stars on the screen and saying, okay, you're in the exact same X, Y coordinates as you were 2 years ago. So for those really advanced long projects, especially through high magnification, that's the answer there. For me, I don't personally use plate solving, so I would just use a reference image. And a lot of times, I'm using different equipment year over year, so I'm shooting it at different focal lengths, which can be really interesting sometimes. So next time I'll shoot Orion, and I've just got M42 in there, and I'll layer that in Photoshop and combine it with my larger image and just kind of keep adding to it in different ways. And there's some rotation involved, but I handle all of that in Photoshop. So the scaling, the rotation, the aligning, it's a matter of, well, in the alignment, putting a low opacity over it, changing it to 50%, lining up those stars. They make great registration points, right? So did I answer it correctly?
Absolutely.
Good. That was the right answer? Yes, sir.
So what's the ratio of actual photography to post-processing?
I love that you said the actual photography, because it's called astrophotography, but some people are only interested in the data, and all the power to them, but getting their data from remote telescopes where it's someone else's equipment, it's all set up for them, and they're clicking, I want to take a picture of this. To me, that's no longer photography. Photography means taking pictures yourself. So I just want to get that rant out of there to start. So ideally it's 50-50, because there's some long nights out acquiring data in the image acquisition mode, but sometimes that processing time really starts to add up, and it's not uncommon to spend 20 hours on stacking and processing your image that you've collected that took maybe 5 hours worth of setup time and actual exposure time. So it quickly, the processing ends up taking a lot longer. Sometimes it's dead even. It took 10 hours of exposure time, 10 processing hours. But yeah, it's interesting. I'd say more often than not, there's more processing time than actual photography. Sure. Over here. Oh, sorry. We'll go back. Yes.
Quick questions. I know you use Deep Sky Stacker. Can
Yes.
you use Sequator instead of?
Yes, you can. That's one of the ones I've heard of, and I hear often. I haven't used it myself, but yeah, as long as it has registering capabilities. So these software, all they do is essentially line up the stars on top of each other. They know how to handle calibration frames. I'm not sure if Sequator does that as well. It does. You can put dark frames in there too.
Yeah.
So yeah, of course. And then it's going to spit out this image. In the case of Deep Sky Stacker, it's a high resolution TIFF file, and then you can bring that into Photoshop and start processing it even further. Yeah.
Pollution filters. There's some that are external, like what Lone Spec has. Could you use that in like Portal 7 instead of the ones directly on?
Right, yeah, so for sure. So it's, is it like a 77mm thread on? Yeah.
Could fit on something.
You don't see those in the light pollution filter world, although I did see one come out, it's coming out soon, but you don't see those a lot, only because they would get really expensive. A 77mm, you can imagine how much that $1,000 filter would be. Most of the ones I like to use are the 2-inch thread-end filters, and those sit between the telescope and the camera. But I really love these clip filters for DSLR because the versatility of being able to use them underneath a lens and with a telescope. Yeah, that Lonely Spec one, I know it was, I can't remember the name of it, but
yeah, a Davidium one, but he sort of sits like the
yeah. Oh, and yeah, and it's like the square style. Yeah. You don't see those very often. I'm sure they work fine, but light pollution filters are one of those things where I'm hesitant to recommend a specific one, although I often do, because it really depends on what it's like for your skies. So I found that out when our city upgraded to LED street lamps in the last 3 years. That totally changed the light profile for my backyard and the light pollution. More of the cool blues and less of the old school orange, red colors, which are actually easier to filter out. So it really depends on the light pollution and where you're shooting from. And yeah, like the best way to find out is there's a site called Astrobin, or Flickr is good, where you can actually sort by the gear used, and then just see examples of that filter in use on certain objects, see how it's performing before you make your decision. But yeah, like I said, those larger filters you don't see a lot just because it's a cost thing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My question, Tom.
Sorry, just because you already went, we're going to get a couple more.
If you're not shooting with a camera that's got the IR removed specifically for Astro, is there a filter that I could buy as an add-on
Yes.
to accomplish the same goal?
Unfortunately not for just a filter that would do the same thing as opening up that wavelength like modifying would. No, I will say a stock camera you can do a lot with. It's not that it ignores it completely on objects with hydrogen alpha in it. So it's just going to be a lot weaker of a signal. So I understand a lot of people don't want to modify their regular all-purpose camera just for astrophotography. They still want to use it during the day. And there's no filter that actually can do that for you. There are filters made for stock cameras because it's a different type of filter. The Astronomic CLS is for stock cameras. The CLS CCD is for modified cameras. But yeah, you're going to have to bite the bullet And I wouldn't recommend modifying a camera yourself these days because they're a lot more advanced. It was a Canon XSI that I modified, so that's 2011. But there's a lot of services that do it now professionally, like Spencer's Camera in the US, and there's independent guys that modify cameras as well. If you're in a situation,
here, you giving me permission to buy another camera.
yeah, that's why you need here. Yeah, you have permission. You need another camera.
Thank you.
I was wondering, that image you have up there now, what's the crop factor? 10 times?
So crop from the original. Okay, so first of all, it was taken with a crop sensor camera. So the focal length was it was long. It was taken through a 250 millimeter telescope, the William Optics Red Cat, with a crop sensor camera, 1.6 times. So it's equivalent to 400 millimeters as far as the size of the image. It doesn't actually increase the focal length. But then the image itself was cropped quite heavily. So I don't think I shared it or not. This is probably about 50%. So it was a much larger image. But then again, of course, I've blended in newer images through higher magnification scopes and blended that into that field of view. So the actual image, yeah, about the original question, I've cropped it about 50%. It was actually quite a bit larger than that, but I wanted to kind of get a good look at it.
Better idea.
Yeah.
One more, take the last one.
Okay.
Getting back to the filter removals, what's the thinking on looking at the anti-aliasing filter that's commonly?
The which filter?
Anti-aliasing filter, what's the thinking on that, removing those?
I don't, so that one has to do with focusing and sharpness, I would imagine, but there's lots of different kinds of mods out there. I really don't have a good answer for that one. So the one that I did myself and the only modified camera that I purchased were both a full spectrum mod, which is just taking that IR filter out of there. Other ones will put in an astrophotography friendly IR cut filter in there. The I don't even know how to say it. I'm not familiar with it. Yeah, that's not the question I want to answer. And on. That's not smart to say. Thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Thank you.
So this was my third time attending one of Trevor's talks this year, and every time I learned something new and exciting. And he spoke to the steep learning curve with the hobby of astrophotography, and when I started this a few years ago, I had a full head of hair. So it's a steep learning curve, and as far as what I prefer, the photography versus the post-processing, I certainly have an affinity for the photography aspect, and I'm starting to get a little warmer towards the post-processing. And with Trevor's help, I've almost seen every single one of your videos, almost 120 of your videos over the past couple of years that I started following, and it's a great follow, and I highly recommend. I'm not getting any payback from Trevor or anything, but I highly recommend to follow his astrobackyard.com and his YouTube channel. It's truly remarkable. So thanks again for your speech and your talk, and here's a little thank you, our calendar, and a thank you card. So let's give him another round of applause.